Good evening, everyone. Great to have you here. I want to welcome you to tonight's roundtable on the U.S. election. My name is Peter Trubowitz. I'm a professor of international relations and the director of the Fallon U.S. Center that is hosting tonight's roundtable discussion. So if you were like me, kind of early this morning, you picked up your phone and you looked at the news feed and your eyes got very wide and you saw that Donald Trump and the Republicans were well on their way to a huge victory. For someone who was counted out, is basically politically dead 4 years ago, is a pretty stunning reversal, and in fact counted out by members, not all, but many members of his own party. As of this hour, Donald Trump has amassed over 71 million votes, roughly 51% of the popular vote, and a majority of the Electoral College. I think he's actually at 277 in the Electoral College. There's still a few states that the votes are outstanding, but he has a majority. In addition to taking the White House, the Republicans have flipped the Senate, and they may hold on to the House. Typically, traditionally in the United States, when the president's party takes the House, especially if they take the popular vote, they win the popular vote, it's still unclear, and it probably will be for several more days in the case of the House. Anyway, much has been said about Trump's victory. Much is going to be said over the next the weeks and months ahead by analysts kind of poring over the results. I mean, just looking at the exit polls, we put together a few slides. I would say just when you look at the exit polls, one thing is very clear, that this was a pretty broad-based victory. That is to say that he didn't win it by just putting one or two voter blocks together. He outperformed his numbers in 2020 in many, many categories. Here are just a few aspects, we still don't know the turnout, whether or not it eclipsed 2020. It appears that it'll come slightly under, but I think that's TBD still. When you look at the most important issues facing the country, Democrats identified the state of democracy and abortion as the most important, and Republicans focused on the economy and immigration. And as you can see, there was a gender gap, but this gender gap is narrower than what the polls were predicting prior in the run-up to the election. And it is clear as well that the Democratic advantage with women is smaller this election than in 2020. And Trump and the Republican advantage with men increased. Arguably, under the heading of, let's say, race, the most striking thing is Latino support for Donald Trump. He boosted his numbers from 2020, he was about 32%. He's come in here at about 45%. There are other things to say here, but I think there was a lot of talk about African American voters really switching to Trump. That's not where the big change is. It's among the Latino voters. There is a significant shift also, not as dramatic, among young voters in general. He has outperformed himself, outperformed 2020, but especially with young white male voters. One of the most dramatic things, I think, but perhaps not surprising, this has been building for a while in the United States, is the breakdown by education. This is consistent with what polls were showing, but here it's in pretty stark relief. And finally, there are those independent voters. The independent voters nationally did break mostly for, broke for Harris. She did better with them. But when you drill down in some of the individual states, Georgia, the result is quite stunning. Donald Trump reversed his performance in 2020 with independent voters. So there's a lot to talk about just in the results, and of course, what it all means, what it means domestically in the United States, and what the implications of Trump's victory are for the rest of the world. Fortunately, we had the good sense at the US Center to schedule this in advance. I will admit I wasn't certain whether we would have such solid results by this evening. But we're, I think, in very good hands this evening. Joining me on the panel, starting nearest to me, is Joe Sternberg, who is a member of the editorial board at the Wall Street Journal, where he writes the political economics column. Next to him is Mukulika Banerjee, who is a professor of anthropology here at the LSE, and who has written extensively about elections and democracy in India and elsewhere. And Keith Magee, Senior Fellow in Culture and Justice at UCL, and Chair and Professor of Practice in Social Justice at Newcastle University. Welcome all. It's great to have all of you here. So just a few words before we get started about the game plan. So I've asked each of them to talk for about 5 minutes each to give us their takeaway or takeaways from the election. And then we'll move to discussion. I know we have an online audience. What we will do is get questions in from the audience here as well as folks online. Just before we get started, if you haven't already silenced your phone, please do that so that it doesn't disrupt things. And we're going to go ahead and start. We picked straws. We're going to start with Joe here and go right down the line. Joe, what's your takeaway?
Thanks, Peter, and for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for turning out on this beautiful Wednesday evening weather that we've got here in November. Let me just mark down the time that I'm starting so I won't ramble too long at you. I want to talk about two surprising outcomes from this election, one of which is probably not the surprise that you think that I'm going to talk about, and the other of which I think is arguably a good thing. And before I tell you what those two surprises are, I want to make a general observation about this election, which is that I think that at the end of the day, this was probably not as unusual a US election as you might think it was. I mean, it seems like a very unusual election because one of the candidates was Donald Trump. But I think if you kind of take that factor away for a minute and you think about the underlying dynamic of the election and what has been going on in the US over the past few years, you have an economy where there was a lot of reason for voters to suspect that, or to believe that the economy was not working for them. We've had the worst inflation in 40 years over the past couple of years, and I think that all of the data suggests that people's real earnings have not yet caught up to that. And I think that that is always a very difficult political environment if you were an incumbent political party, as the Democrats were in this cycle. I think that you have an issue like what Republicans describe as the immigration crisis or the southern border crisis. I think that that is always that kind of law and order or national security issue is always toxic for any party that happens to be in power when that is happening. So I think from that perspective, it's not unusual that you would expect the incumbent party to lose, which in fact is what has happened here. And so I think that if it had been any other candidate than Trump, we probably would not be surprised by the fact that the Republican has won the election. And so that actually gets to what I think is the first surprise here, which is that Trump didn't win by a bigger margin. I think that there's been a conventional wisdom that if the Republicans had nominated any other candidate, say especially someone like a Nikki Haley, we would have been talking about a 10 percentage point difference in the popular vote and a huge electoral college blowout. So I think that one of the surprises here, which is the Trump factor, isn't necessarily that he won, but that he didn't win by a bigger margin. And the second surprise is actually kind of getting at something Peter mentioned in his opening comments, which is that this evening as we sit here, we know what the result is. And I think that this is actually a very positive surprise, because I had thought coming into this that the nightmare scenario was that we would have a coin toss election that was just on the edge of a knife in all of these swing states, and then we would have weeks and weeks or months and months of litigation and social tension about the result. And I think that even if you happen to be unhappy with who the winner of the election is, I think that it's probably a good development for America's political culture that there is a winner. Because I think that this practice of various forms of election denial that would tend to pop up on both sides of the aisle in various forms was becoming very corrosive, and whatever other problems we're going to have now, we will not have that. So I think that those are, I think, the two big surprises that I've taken away from this.
Yeah. So basically, on the first point there, it was a referendum election, in a sense, on the incumbent party.
They always are,
yeah.
Aren't they? I mean, it's always, it's that classic trope in American politics, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?
Right. Ronald Reagan framed in that 1980 election. And I think just maybe to add to that, I mean, you had, I think in the exit polls it shows that 70%, roughly 70% of Americans were unhappy with the direction of the country. That's just a tremendous amount of weight for somebody, for any candidate, Kamala Harris or anybody else, to carry. So that's helpful. Muku, what about the international implications of this? When you think about this, I mean, what's the takeaway, like in India?
I mean, look at this room, look at this university, it's so international. We have a globe on campus, which is upside down. We didn't show it to you, but people like being photographed next to it. So I think my comments will be inspired by that space, by that upside down globe. To really speak both as an outsider to American politics, and outsider in the sense of I don't study American politics, but I follow it closely, but also from a different vantage. I'm an anthropologist. I think about society as most of my colleagues work in Latin America, Asia, Africa, and I want to sort of make some remarks on what today's news looks like from other parts of the world, many of which are represented in this room too. Obviously, America has had outsiders have done well. The classic book on democracy is Democracy in America, written by Tocqueville, who was a French aristocrat, and very much like an anthropologist, didn't just study institutions or look at how democracy worked. He actually spent some time traveling, talking to people, observing how people interact with each other. What later Dewey called associated living. What does a democratic society look like in terms of hierarchy and civility and so on. But when when I think of that and I think of the vantage I occupy and I'm representing, the beast of the United States of America that dominates global news, and which is why all of us are interested in the results, the outcome today. I mean, there have been 40 elections this year, but this is the one we all wanted to know what happens. From these continents, the underbelly of American democracy has been very evident. And today it seems like the real flip is that underbelly of America has been exposed to Euro North America, which has had a very different experience. Most of this world, I think, Peter, has lived with a cognitive dissonance about American democracy. On the one hand, America is the land of opportunity. It celebrates entrepreneurship and creativity. It's had amazing ideas of the founding fathers. It's dealt with its difficult history of dispossession of the First Nation, of slavery, and so on, and tried to write a constitution, coin the phrase, we the people, thought about how do you create a we-ness in this diverse population. So America had that inspirational democratic story, I think, for many nations. And yet, the democracy that it policed in the world as a policeman of democracy was a very different one. It went around with a checklist and looked at nations and decided whether it was democratic or not on the basis of a list of institutions to see, do you have free and fair elections, do you have a free media, do you have separation of powers, etc. And the clipboard got ticks on it, and then if you were, if you had enough ticks, you were us, and if you're not, you were them. And that's how the world was seen by America's export of democracy. And at the same time, while this was happening, there are all these examples that people remember and talk about, and they're talking about in the global press today, that the record of toppling democratic governments, think Algeria, of supporting dictators in Latin America, of propping up Islamic extremism in Pakistan for the sake of being allowed in to fight the Russians in Afghanistan, of nuclear tests in the Pacific, wiping out populations. This is also a record that people have had to reckon with. So there is, I think there has been a lot of anger through this election and expression of this anger, which in some cases has really affected outcomes in particular seats over Gaza. But I think the anger about Gaza and the aiding and abetting is not coming out of nowhere. It's coming out from this much longer history that people in Latin America and Asia and Africa have encountered and thought about a long time. So one thing that I would say about today's election, when I think about it in terms of this cognitive dissonance, is that this checklist of democracy seems to be what America has demonstrated today, bizarrely. The institutional, it's been, like you said, a fair, an election. We have an outcome. There was such nervousness. Are we going to get results? Will they be disputed? No. Everything worked fine. $15 billion was spent. Most of the money went back to media houses, I think. That's where. And we have a result. And yet, we know that the politics that has been voted in is as undemocratic as you would say. I mean, you ostracize minorities, you disenfranchise women, you, with impunity, say you're going to shoot your opponents. This is not democratic society. So what we've seen is precisely that checklist kind of model of democracy, where the institutional structure of democracy is working, but the democratic culture it's meant to create is simply not there. Thank you.
Thank you, Muku. Keith, what's your takeaway?
Well, I guess I have to start by framing myself as, the Reverend Professor, right? So the idea that I come to the space as a public theologian. So the basis of that is that, Moses went to Mount Sinai and came down with 10 public policies. So how do we now take and infuse the idea of how our well-being is integrated with the sense of morality? Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said that the prophet's role is to be God's voice in humanity's consciousness, to constantly call us to bridge the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And so if we use that framing in this moment with what has happened in the American election, the question becomes, to me, how do we get to justice? With all these things that have happened, and how is this moment a level of accountability for America to the world and to itself, with all of the rhetoric of the promise of what democracy and freedom looks like? And, the other idea is, Martin Luther King Jr. says the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. How do we get to justice? What does justice actually look like? How do we ensure that there is accountability and checks and balances? How does the Constitution still be a living, true document? How do we, in this moment, ensure that we have impartial courts and fair and free elections, and they not be questioned as they were the last time? And how is there the assurance in this moment of the safeguarding of civil rights? How do we ensure that? And how do we, in this moment, both deal with our despair and our determination to be a true democracy, to be reflective towards the world as to who we've said we were, and to own that in truth? And what I've seen as a underpinning in this from the public theologian space is this idea that we have a religious ideology, a theological ideology that's embedded in this argument that we haven't deeply explored. There's these issues of morality that keep appearing. What does it mean to have a moral consciousness? And how do we frame that in this moment that we're in going forward? How do we come to a place of meaningful civic engagement about all of who we are? How do we bring our deepest moral convictions into the room rather than checking them outside the door before entering, as Michael Sandel says, right? How do we get to that kind of space that we can be brave and courage and have courage to talk about the issues that are present, that are with us? How much of this moment in America and around the world will represent some sense of religious values that doesn't represent the world's religious values? That's here. A lot of what we saw and have seen play out in this election around conservative values. What does it mean? How does Roe, how did it play in this? We've seen some of the data, which is quite interesting, where some states have passed and others haven't, but yet it was there. What about gender? What about marriage equality? So there's this theological underpinning, there's this moral element that I think that we have to explore to get us towards justice and engage in a level of civic dialogue, of understanding what it means, how to get there, and what we have to do as a collective society. And if we keep overlooking these truths, I think that we're going to do ourselves a real disservice. The other thing I'll say is that we have to have the wherewithal to have courage. This is the role of the prophet, to speak truth to power, right? And I think that we have to, even not with your title of reverend, but an anthropologist, a sociologist, or a journalist, to say, I have a prophetic voice, and I have to use that voice and that agency to hold people to account as to what this means and how you bring honor and dignity into your space, what you have to say. And the last thing I'll say is that I think that some folks see this moment as a bright moment, and others see it as dark, right? And I think regardless of how you see it, the work is the same. And what is that work? I think it's how do we use this moment to get to that more perfect union that was promised? What does that look like? How does the Constitution, going forward at this turning point, really become a living document that talks about equality and justice and liberty and for all? I think we can actually find our way to that moment again through many elements. But of course, I'm on an empathy revolution, so.
Well, maybe let's just push a little bit on that. If you could maybe unpack what that might mean politically, institutionally in the United States. Like I wonder, maybe this is more concrete or too narrow from your perspective, but I mean, what's the takeaway for the Democratic Party here? I mean, is it just they lost in a referendum election, or is it that, they need to kind of either get back to some core issues, that they need to work at the local and the state level as well as the national level? I mean, I got somebody tweeted or texted me earlier today, an old friend, saying, what's the is there a silver lining for the Democrats in all of this? And I had a response, but I'm more curious.
Well, I think the Democrats really need an actual strategy. I think they need to do more than just show up. I think that they have to identify what all of these issues are and what they look like.
Yeah.
So is there a lack of moral consciousness in the Democratic Party? And I think that that's what part of the Republican Party was able to play on.
Yeah.
They have a sense of values, whether they live true to those values or not. Whereas the Democratic Party say, we just accept everything, we accept everyone, and it's all going to be okay. I think there has to be a strategy as to what that looks like, right, and what it represents, and it needs to be much more solid. And that's complex within itself, right? Because we are a nation of faiths and beliefs and traditions and cultures. All of those things exist, but there's no landing space for us. Like, I think that there could be a very solid way forward if the Democrats really focused on an economy that represented everyone, yeah, right? And we can dig deeper into that. I think that the play would have been better if they would have really looked towards what was happening with the poor and the marginalized across the country, to say, how do we truly lift the poor out of poverty? How do we deal with some of the issues that we only suggest exist in developing countries but exist in America? How do we deal with the towns in America that don't have running water? How do we deal with the towns in America that don't have school systems that are still closed from Brown? How do we deal with those sorts of things? That could give the party real agency, because it would be as though you're coming for the people that feel like they've been left behind. And then, of course, there are other dynamics. But I think that core base, I'm challenged by the core base of what we say is Donald Trump's party, not the Republican Party, because I was once upon a time a Republican. Right, the Republican Party, that base, how did the Democrats miss them? And where's their strategy to get them?
Muku, I know you want to jump in.
I do want to jump in. And, one thing, I mean, you mentioned it briefly, and we must talk about it, as people have said. Watching the news last night, every time a Trump supporter was interviewed, they said, I'm worried about the economy, and that's why I'm voting for Trump. I mean, it was significant that there were mostly all men saying this, so I don't know whether this is sort of macho speak for patriarchy, to talk about money and the economy, but they talked about the economy a lot. And the fact is that the economy is actually done rather well. It is booming. The head of Moody's says, it's never, in 35 years, I've never seen an economy do this well. Real wages have risen, but they've risen from a 2020 low. and people feel that generationally they're not making progress, right? So there is work to be done. Like you say, if you are going to talk about poverty, on the one hand, we also know this is the LSE. You can measure economic growth and say an economy is booming, whereas actually most people don't feel the benefits of it. There is social inequality, wages rise. Yes, the median wage here has risen for blue-collar and white-collar workers in these last 4 years. Why is this not being communicated? You're saying what is the thing with the Democratic Party? And I just wanted to share here a quote by Obama and Kamala Harris, actually, when after the 2020 election victory, she started her acceptance speech quoting John Lewis, the congressman and civil rights activist. She said, "Democracy is not a state, it is an act," right? And Obama spoke straight after her, and he congratulated everyone, and he said, yes, while voting is the first and most basic act of a citizen in a democracy, he reminded everyone that it had to be more than that. And I quote him, "Your efforts made a difference. Enjoy this moment." But then he went on to say, "Then stay engaged. I know it can be exhausting, but for this democracy to endure, it requires our active citizenship and sustained focus on the issues, not just in election season, but all the days in between." Right? And this is, I think, what, if you go back to Jefferson or you go back to the people who were worried about democracy, that this idea of active citizenship, of being vigilant, of having to cultivate democracy on an everyday basis, was absolutely, the Republican thought from the early Machiavelli is absolutely germane to this kind of democratic project. Otherwise, it's a mobocracy. Remember, there were lots of people who were detractors of democracy, thinking, if you don't do this, holding the feet to the fire, speaking truth to power, creating civility, creating civic dialogue, all of the things that you were talking about, this is really about cultivation of democratic culture. So that's why I was saying that, this checklist model of, yes, tick, 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 we've got these institutions in place, yes, we are going to, voila, create a democracy. It doesn't work like that. And I think unless that everyday work happens, and to also recognize that it takes time. You need to be patient. You've got to be vigilant. You've got to do it every day. It's a bit like farming. America has such a wonderful tradition of farmer Democrats. Jefferson himself, I went to Monticello this year, and it was great to see his drawings, intricate drawings, completely invested in the process of farming. Thoreau writing about farming and growing beans and why that created a self-cultivation to make yourself a certain kind of democratic citizen. There is a tradition of thought in America about these things, but we need to take this quite seriously, not just reduce it to a checklist.
Joe.
Okay, look, I work for a financial newspaper, so I'll pick up the economics theme. I mean, we are at the LSE, so it's on brand.
Yeah, it's good. It's safe.
I'm actually curious to take a show of hands from the audience. How many of you watched the video of Donald Trump at the McDonald's? And all of it. I mean, not just like a minute or two clip. But actually, he was yes.
Nobody wants it.
Yeah, he was at that McDonald's for a long time. There's a lot of video of him learning how to make the French fries, serving them to the people at the drive-thru, and I would strongly recommend that you go and find copies of an extended play version of Trump at the McDonald's. Because I think that illustrates the trap the Democrats are going to have to avoid when they talk about the economy and how they can come up with some kind of policy and political offer moving forward for all of these voters, many of them in America we would say blue-collar voters who used to be part of the Democratic coalition for decades and decades and now aren't. And I think that if you watch that video of Trump at the McDonald's, the thing that will stand out in a weird way, I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this, it almost becomes mesmerizing, is how personable he is. And this uncanny capacity that he has to talk to the kid who's teaching him how to fry the French fries, and talk to the woman who's teaching him how to, handle and put together the orders and put the fries into the bag and hand them over to the customers, in the natural way that he's interacting with the people in this drive-through. And the one thing that you can't see anywhere is any hint that he's patronizing these people. I think that the Democratic Party has run into a real problem on a lot of economic policies where the attitude can seem to be, okay, well, we have sat around in our studies in our libraries and our offices, and we have come up with a checklist of policies that are going to help you, and you're just going to take it because it's good for you. I think that something is going terribly wrong in the way that the Democratic Party is communicating with these voters. I think that it's also a problem that political parties in a lot of parts of the West are having right now, in the way that they communicate with the voters that they know that they're trying to serve. But something is broken down, first off, in their understanding of what actually matters to these voters, which is often very different from the impression that you might get if you're sitting around on a university campus or in an economics consultancy somewhere. And so there's this misunderstanding of what counts to them. And then there's this, add-on problem of how you communicate that. And I think that if you can't take seriously the fact that Trump is very successful at communicating that, and then also at sort of intuiting, I don't know if it's his long marketing background or what it is, but this uncanny ability he has to intuit what people want from him and then how he can communicate that back to them. I think that if you can't take that seriously, and if you just think that it's pandering that's coming from him, or if you just think that it's about him tapping into some darker impulse that may or may not be there in this segment or that segment of the electorate, you're going to continue being very confused and surprised by this kind of election result.
Could I just...
Yeah.
So I think it's very interesting, Josh, that, and I appreciate this ideal of Trump's humanity and that it's displayed in this sort of way. I didn't watch the McDonald's bit because I understood it was all staged and it was all produced. So with the production of that, you can get what you suggest. I think the missing element is how to then bring truth to what that represents about how does Trump and Kamala and anyone else really care about the least advantaged amongst us, and not a staged element of what you've done with the fries or your level of engagement, but actually translating into policy. As we talked about, there are so many people experiencing social inequity based upon what's happening in the economy, that as they see it, but it's actually working for them, but it hasn't been delivered to them. I would rather you not go to McDonald's and you spend more time translating policy so that people understand what it takes to get the money into my pocket. You see, and so I think that part of it is, yes, we do these things to stage to do what he successfully did, but how do we do the translation of policy into everyday people's lives so that they understand the impact? And that's what I think is the missing element. Years ago, America, there was a time during Reagan where there were all these commodities that were landed into people's homes with cheese and whatever, peanut butter and these things that they gave. So I think that people, everyday people that are out there working, the working poor, need to have something more translatable where they're actually seeing a tangible outcome. And I think that that's where you make the difference.
Well, obviously the McDonald's thing was staged because all of these campaign appearances are, but I think that the point you have to understand is that precisely because they are all fake, it's so easy for them to go terribly wrong for a candidate. I mean, Americans of a certain generation will remember Michael Dukakis in The Tank in 1988. I mean, it was this awful photo op that was meant to boost his, sort of image and, whatever, and improve his favorables in the polls, and it just ended up seeming ridiculous. And that's because either you've got that charisma and that ability to communicate, or you don't. And I think that Trump does seem to have that, and I think that it's probably important, and not to scoff at that, and I think it's probably a bad political strategy for the Democrats if they do.
I hear you.
Go ahead.
No, I absolutely hear you. I see this human element, as you're suggesting, come forth for Donald Trump that's also talking about people from an island that's a part of America calling it garbage. Right? So how does this humanity reconcile itself? But we could deal with that later.
Well, yeah, so I kind of want to turn it in a slightly different direction. So one question I was asked a lot today. I figured since I had to answer it, maybe I'd ask you, which is, what are the implications of this on this side of the pond? Like, what does this mean for the UK or maybe Europe more generally, or, pick your part of the world, but, Muku, you picked up on part of this, but this is a guy who ran one of the key elements of his platform is slapping tariffs of somewhere between 10 and 20% on goods it could be from Canada or Mexico or
India.
Yeah, the UK.
China.
You get special treatment if you're in China, right? Because the tariff there is minimally 60% is what he has in mind. So, this has really caused tremendous angst here. And then, of course, there's the whole question of Kiev, Ukraine, and European security. But it goes beyond that. I suppose, can we just maybe collect some thoughts about what the takeaway is over here, either at the level of policy or politics? Maybe I'll start by saying one thing that really, I think, one of the consequences of this, of Trump's re-election after the 4-year interlude, is that it is going to embolden anti-globalists and populists in Europe and elsewhere. That it matters that this happened in the U.S., and I take the point that some of this is really, it's a response to inflation and so forth. But I think Donald Trump is also tapping, and I think this is part of the discussion here, a vein of resentment and grievance, and that is expressed in all kinds of ways, but he's kind of harnessed that. And so I think there's going to be a political kind of knock-on effects, but there's also policy effects. I don't know. Thoughts?
Well, I think it's already, we've spent so much time focusing on America that we forget that there were 53 other national elections around the world.
Yeah.
So, right? And so what has happened in America has been happening in other places. I think the impact is that it's only going to fuel more of this kind of authoritarian leadership that will be able to impose more restrictions that will leave. You'll probably hear a reoccurring theme of me caring about the poor, that will leave more poor people behind and more disenfranchised. And so that's what I think the global impact is going to be. I wish we would realize that there's something that happened in Guatemala and Chile and other places also that are mirroring, obviously to a different scale because of what America represents as an economic power, but there are these things that are happening around the globe.
I think, if there's one thing one can say about Trump is complete consistency in a disregard for rules. And that, I think that disregard for universal rules applies. He's absolutely, he's come to the brink of threatening to pull out of NATO, reduce its contributions, doesn't see a problem with Ukraine, doesn't see, his entire family is waiting to invest in real estate in Israel, Gaza. there are, I think we're talking about norms. We're talking about a sort of system of international rules-based order, as it used to be called. And this is there are no rules at home, there are no rules abroad. And obviously that's going to have a consequence for every single bilateral relationship as well as with NATO, which is going to have a knock-on effect. The Quad, but one thing I'll say about talking again, and I'm very conscious, I want to keep this perspective of how the rest of the world is thinking about this, that I've had lots of conversations in the last few months as these 50-odd elections have happened this year, that there is a real sense in Asia and Africa and Latin America that the world order as it has been for a very long time now is shifting. So when we talk about a multipolar world, people are saying that yes, there are other. And you say, well, you think this is Putin, you think it's fine to, that he gets away with what he wants to, or China, India playing its own game. And people say, well, we've had this kind of bipolarity of Cold War and then the US-China spat, and it's a different world. Things are shifting. The dominance that we've got used to is perhaps ebbing. So. And then you said specifically about Britain. I was just looking for the piece, but David Edgerton, our colleague across the Strand at King's, has a piece on lessons for UK politics today in The Guardian. And there is, to go back to what you were saying, there is something about doing politics, about communicating policy, about, you can do good things, but if you're not communicating it properly to the right people, you don't get the dividends. Performing humanity is more than actually having it, and that's what I think that McDonald's, because you cannot, I'm sorry, I'm the only female on this panel, I cannot talk about humanity in a person who is a repeat sex offender. There's no humanity as far as I'm concerned. So he has the common touch, which I think is something that politicians do need to inculcate, and very popular and very cerebral politicians in this country have had it. Whether you think of Churchill or Blair or there are role models. So there is something about being able to communicate and to appeal that there are lessons that people all over Europe, really it's Europe that needs to learn lessons. Modi, as I keep saying in India, is Trump on steroids, right? He's been at this game forever. His entire career has been a politician. Erdogan has been in Turkey for much longer than anyone can remember. So it's really Europe where the polarization, and I think Larry Kramer, the president of LSE, was saying at an earlier event, at his own inaugural, that Europe is really 15 years behind where America is at the moment. He keeps saying this, and I've been thinking about it, whether this is, in fact, I'm happy to, debate this, and I'd love to hear what people make. But I think Europe does need to learn about what right-wing politics looks like, the humanity, the common touch, the messaging, the polarizing, the naked, absolute naked hatred of minorities of any sort, and the misogyny. It seems to be part of this package. And so what you do to counter it is something that, there has to be some collective thinking on.
Joe.
I want to come back to the foreign policy question. To make the point, I'm not convinced that Trump actually cares very much about foreign policy. The only idea in the foreign policy vein that he has, which is the tariffs, is a bad one. So I think that needs to be the start of an answer to your question, because that has a couple of follow-ups. First off, one thing that you could see happening in his first term is that he wasn't so much creating new policy in a lot of these areas as he was bringing to the surface a consensus that had been forming in Washington for a long time. And I think that was most visible in a lot of the issues to do with the relationship with China or trade with China, where there had been actually this consensus of skepticism that had been developing in Washington for a while, and then Trump kind of bubbled that up to the surface. And I think that another consequence of this is that oftentimes his relationships with the rest of the world are going to be very transactional.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, if we want to avoid this conversation this evening becoming too morose, I think that one good development that will probably help European countries, and particularly NATO allies, in dealing with Trump 2.0 is that, especially in the wake of the Ukraine war, a lot of European countries have already delivered on his big ask in the first term, which was increasing defense spending. So I think that it probably helps the rest of the world's relationship with Trump and Trump's relationship with the rest of the world that you have actually seen some of these developments, which he didn't even start, because the aspiration to prod our European allies into spending more on defense dates back to the Obama administration. But I think that, that's kind of an example of how, if you think about it in somewhat more transactional terms, that maybe opens up avenues for finding ways that other governments can deal with him.
All right. Okay. We're going to open it up. I'm going to start taking questions from the floor. We'll start with a woman right in the center with a green sweatshirt, kind of gray.
Yeah.
Right, you've got your hand up. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Really great to be here. I really wanted to ask about...
Can you give your name and...
Yeah, I'm Julia.
Yeah.
I'm a master's in IR student and also in American Grand Strategy. So,
Okay. Good
nice
for
to see you, Trubowitz. I wanted to ask about Kamala specifically in the context of the racism and misogyny that we've seen coming out of the right wing of the Republican Party, and specifically amongst Gen Z men who came out very largely for Trump. And I'm just kind of curious, speaking to the idea of the potential of a female president in the U.S. and speaking to the wave of misogyny and patriarchy that we've seen, if this is something that the U.S. can overcome in the next couple of elections.
Okay. There's a gentleman back there, about 2/3 of the way back. He's got his computer open. Well, that doesn't really distinguish him. Keep going. Just to your right. A little more. Perfect. Right there. You.
Hi, I'm Adam. I'm just a third-year law student.
Just. Okay, that's good.
I want to ask, surely it is paradoxical to contend that the Republican Party possesses this distinctive framework of values when its leader is someone that, for example, last year was found liable for sexual abuse, or in 2021 conspired to overturn the transfer of power through the creation of fraudulent electors. So I just wanted to know, how has the American public resonated with the moral platform of the Republican Party in the extraordinary circumstances surrounding Trump's candidacy?
And then we're going to take a question online. We'll have multiple rounds here. Chris, can you come right down here to the front? And Chris is going to read a question from online.
Thank you. Just to say that there are more than 300 people watching online, and they're from countries including the US, France, Egypt, China, Greece, Turkey, Serbia, Ireland, Spain, Mexico, Pakistan, and Uruguay. So this question comes
A little bit of interest in the US.
This question comes from Nurulamin Abbas, who is an alumni of LSE Ideas, and they would like some comment on the observation that Democrats have lurched too far into populism through, I think, policies like fiscal profligacy. Despite the many faults of Trump, he offered a more realistic pathway to the centrist right leanings of most Americans.
Who wants which question? Keith, you want to start?
Sure.
Yeah.
So, Adam, I think I'll try to give you an answer as this ideal of democratic values and how there's this ideal of how does it resonate. I think one of the things we have to consider is Donald Trump and this GOP movement that we're seeing has played into the truths of the framing of the American democracy and Constitution, which was created and framed by white Christian men. So there's this ideal of white Christian men who are talking about this God we trust, this whole idea. So this underpinning is this idea that morality exists if we can return a nation to its white male Christian values. And that's what we've seen play out here. I think it's a bunch of hypocrisy that is aligned with it, but that's where this message seems to resonate, because if it can return to how it was framed, to only include those who framed it, then there's going to be real value.
Joe, go ahead.
Okay, I will stumble into the briar patch of Julia's racism and misogyny question. So I think one question that one has to grapple with seriously is whether American voters actually believe that that is what Trump is about. And I think that kind of his startling performance among various minority groups like African Americans or Latino voters, and then also the fact that there was much less of a gender gap in the final results than we thought there was going to be, suggests that actually that is perhaps less of a factor than the conventional wisdom would have us believe. And the other point I would go back to is something that an observation I made right at the beginning, which is kind of the counterfactual for this Trump-Harris election that we had. And that's to imagine what would have happened if the Republicans had done what I and many others thought that they should do, and nominate Nikki Haley. And I think that if that had happened, you would have seen this embrace of the right of Nikki Haley even more so, because I think that that would have created an election where actually the margin of victory for the Republican challenger would have been much higher. And so I think that in fact, I mean, sort of my observation talking to people on the right is the kind of, Trump's rhetoric on a lot of these issues and his behavior is one of those factors that causes a lot of and this is a very important point. I think that we need to understand that as in any American election, a lot of the people who are voting for either candidate are holding their noses while they're doing it.
Yes.
And so I think that it is important to understand that there is always a base on each side that is very enthusiastic about that candidate. And then there are a lot of people who, for reasons that you might think are good reasons or terrible reasons, have decided that they are going to hold their nose on any of these, very unsavory aspects of the candidate. Because they have their priorities. And I think that you can agree or you can disagree with that, but you can't directly argue that they have a racism or a misogyny problem because they have, sort of made that bargain when they were making their voting decision.
Just on that point, too, I mean, I was scribbling this down when Adam, I think it's a response to Adam, but it speaks to just what you just said here. The governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, and he said to a bunch of Republican, he was at a large meeting of Republicans, and he said to them, and he's had a lot of, Trump and Kemp have not been on the same page often, especially over the 2020 result in Georgia. And he said, you don't have to like Donald Trump, you don't have to like who he is as a person. This is a business decision. And it needs to be viewed and approached as a business decision. So that the implication was Trump is offering you policies that are different than what Kamala Harris and the Democrats are offering. Vote for the policies, don't vote for the person. And so I think it was reinforced by a lot of downstream Republicans that kind of view that you could separate Donald Trump, the person, from Donald Trump's policies. Let's take another round of questions. Let's go over to this side. Let's take the gentleman right there in the front. Okay.
Hi, my name is Zachariah, LSE alumnus. Just to Keith's point on moral consciousness, how do you go about legitimizing and institutionalizing a moral high ground to then cultivate that moral consciousness that you were talking about?
And let's take the woman right behind, right there. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Sophie, and I'm a master's student at LSE. My question has to do with climate change and the Paris Agreement. What do you think is going to be the global effect on the fight against climate change if and when Trump resigns from the Paris Agreement?
Let's go to Chris and get a question from him.
Thank you. So this question is from Jürgen Kappenman, who asks, assuming Donald Trump won't be able to complete his second term in office, what would be the consequences of J.D. Vance taking over at some point?
What events? What events?
What would be the consequence of J.D. Vance taking over?
Can I take the
would
climate
you like
question?
You want to take the first question?
The climate question.
Climate question. Go ahead.
At times like this, you thank your stars you're not a U.S. specialist, to have to deal with questions like that. On the climate question, it allows me, I think the last question online we didn't directly tackle, or maybe we did, but I just wanted to say something about, speak to that question. This is a climate denier, right? This is somebody who is the president of the United States, the world's largest economy, who believes climate change is not happening. So obviously there are going to be repercussions. And there'll be all kinds of repercussions. But additionally to that, there is a point to be made, and this goes back to something I was saying earlier, that there is, part of when we were saying, what did the Democrats do wrong? What does Britain have to learn from this? This complete addiction to the idea of growth solving everything. Right? There is enough radical economists giving us alternative ways of creating jobs, livelihoods, well-being, but the narrative of whether it is the Labour Party, whether it is Democrats, is always about economic growth, which means it has consequences for climate directly. It has consequences for social inequality. Some people, most of the population gets left behind. You may get jobs, but there's wage stagnation. And so the people who are voting, who have voted for Trump yesterday, are people who feel genuinely aggrieved by this economic growth story, who've been left behind, whose lives haven't got better, and they hate globalization. And I think, the critique of globalization, if one has to have that conversation, has to come as much in conversation about climate change. You have containers carrying avocados across the world so that a few people can have them smashed on their toast for breakfast. And we think this is fine. If you're going to question this, then it has to be questioned at a structural level. And yet, all we do is repeat this paradigm again and again and again. And we are not going to address the climate question like that. Neither are we going to listen to the people who are voting for Trump because they feel that he's the only one who seems to recognize that they have been hurt by globalization.
Okay.
So to take the question about the moral high ground, thank you. I think there's a real problem here that we don't want to own that a part of the truth of Donald Trump's ascendancy to power and maintaining it is because of racism, sexism, xenophobia, Islamophobia. Shall I go down the list? All of those things are real. And until we name it, until we're brave enough to say, yes, this is the part that's the economy, this is the part that's policy, this is the part that's racism and sexism, and all these others, we will never be able to get to the moral high ground that I propose we need. So the first thing you need to do is name it. The second thing you need to do is determine how to resolve them as real issues. How are we going to deal with the fact that America is racially divided? How are we going to deal with the fact that economically a woman only makes a third of what a man makes, right? How are we going to deal with the wage gaps? How are we going to deal with all those things? Until we name it, we are not going to find ourselves to a place of saying there is a sense of equality, that everyone is assured that's a part of this democracy. And after we name it, begin to address issues, find a real sense of civility, to determine what civility truly is. I often laugh and attempt to frame that the American civil rights movement was to make the uncivil civil. There had to be laws to make the uncivilized civil so that the people who wanted rights could have those rights. So how do we infuse civility with the uncivilized so that we can get to this moral high ground? And I believe the third element of that, it goes back to empathy, to come into the room to understand the other more than you want to understand yourself, and that to be the basis to working towards getting to that moral high ground.
So I'm not sure that brings us to J.D. Vance, but you want to take it or I'll take it?
I'll take it. It's sort of the cross you have to bear if you're going to be the conservative on a panel like this. Well, I mean, this is actually getting at a substantive issue,
Yes.
which I think is going to unfold in American politics in the years to come now, because I think that Trump, okay, if you take a step back, and if we venture back to the 80s, which we've already done once with Dukakis and the tank here, but if you kind of think about what happened in American politics in the 80s and the Reagan era, Reagan really remade the Republican Party comprehensively in his own image. I think that after that era, there was a sort of conventional or orthodox Republican approach to the economy, which was based on his economic policies. I think that and it was so effective that you had Democrats like Clinton co-opting parts of it, and it really became a dominant paradigm in American politics and policy making for a while. Trump has not had that effect on the Republican Party. I think that, there's still a lot of internal division within the party. You can have a lot of people who identify as Republicans who have become very enthusiastic Trump supporters. You can have people sort of who are in the Nikki Haley camp who would have preferred to dislodge him, but have decided that they will hold their noses and support him because, the policy offer they find more convincing than what they were hearing from the Democrats. You have some people who had been Republicans who have drifted out of the party completely as a result of Trump. And so I think that, if he had lost the election yesterday, you would have had this big battle for the heart and soul of the Republican Party, because there would have been the sense that he, barely won the 2016 election in the Electoral College, and he lost the popular vote. He lost the 2018 midterm for Republicans. He lost 2020. His candidates did terribly in 22, and now we've lost again. And then there would have been this process of the Republican Party finding a new direction. He won. So, I mean, an inevitable consequence of that is that, nothing succeeds like success. And, I think that a lot of his supporters within the party are going to say, hey, we've found the secret sauce now. And I think that Vance is going to become the tribune for that faction within the party. And because he is the vice president, that gives him a considerable megaphone to try to exert that kind of influence, and it puts him in the pole position to run 4 years from now, although I hate mentioning the fact that we're going to do this again when we're just digesting the election that happened yesterday. So I think that is going to turn out to be one of the biggest consequences of this election, is actually what is it going to mean for the contours of the Republican Party. And that matters a lot because a healthy democracy requires at least two parties that are capable of attracting a wide electorate and building an electoral coalition. And so there's always this question of what is your plan as a party for doing that?
Well, if I could just on this, maybe just, and then come to you, I mean, and so that everything doesn't fall on the conservative on the panel on J.D. Vance. I mean, if history is any guide in the United States, the chances that J.D. Vance ends up being the successor are low. The last time a vice president got elected president was George Herbert Walker Bush. And then if you think about it, you have to go back to, I believe it's 1836, it's Martin Van Buren. Americans generally do not like a third term of a presidency. They often don't like a second term, as we've seen a fair amount recently. And because of the divisions inside the party, he'll have his work cut out for him, I think. Yeah.
Well, I tell you, I'm more frightened by Vance than I am by Donald Trump. He's smart.
Yeah.
Law degree from
Harvard,
yeah. Right? He understands policy, he understands the government, he understands the role. Yeah. He's not a pawn that has been picked to be in the space. And so it's very frightening to me that it could happen. Yeah. And of course, part of what Donald Trump said is if you vote this time, you won't have to do it again. Yeah. So the idea, right, is that this will have been the last free and fair election. We can't forget that. And so, one of the elements that we should not negate is that part of the reason why we did not, the Democrats, in full transparency, I voted for Nikki Haley. So right. So the Democrats did not, and then I voted a Democrat. But that's neither here nor there. But
we know
the Democrats was concerned about the frailty of Biden, and that's why he needed to stand down. What about the frailty of Donald Trump? So it's not necessarily that a Vance would be reelected. He could, exactly. So those are the sorts of things that I had in my consciousness as this election has played out. Yeah. Because I'm more frightened by Vance as an extremist than Donald Trump.
Let's take in some more questions here. Oh, man. How about woman back 2/3 of the way there? Yeah, you're just, yeah, there you go.
Hiya, my name is Annabelle. I'm an LSE alum from a couple of years back, and I attended a similar kind of postmortem after the 2022 midterm elections here, where a similar kind of contention was on candidate quality, and that was particularly focused on the Republican side. And I think a lot of the conversation that we've had tonight makes me think about the potential not only soul searching that the Democrats have to do on a broader scale, but on a more specific scale on candidate quality. Yeah. Who might they have that's eligible beyond that, well, isn't already pension eligible, but might that, whether it's Buttigieg, whether it's AOC, will just be eligible then. Where is candidate quality in the, on the importance level, on that scale? And what is it that Democrats can do to produce higher quality candidates that can beat that next generation, as we were just saying, of MAGA-esque Republicans?
Great question, great forward-looking question. Let's go to the center here. How about right down here in the, okay, yeah. I don't know if you are in the center, but yeah.
Hi, my name is Danielle. I'm a final year undergraduate at LCD, American Grad Strategy, so hi.
Yeah.
Mukulika, you said that Europe is a few years behind America. Now, this past year, we've seen a shift to the right in terms of politics globally, and it's been solidified with this election in the USA. So do you think you can see the US taking charge in that shift and leading that as well as in other things? And if so, what would that look like in the future?
Chris will give you another question here.
Thank you. So this question comes from Jalen Shahid El from North Carolina, who is a human rights and politics grad student at LSE. And their question is, to what extent do you think Trump's actions and rhetoric reflect authoritarian tendencies like fascism?
That's a light question. So, Joe. Pick whichever one you would like. Who wants to go first?
Okay, I'll take the fascism question. Well, okay, look, here's the problem that I think the Democrats never got over with this whole fascism issue. Is he a fascist, sort of Mussolini type, who is going to get the trains to run on time and also is going to kill American democracy because he has the wherewithal to be hyper-disciplined and very effective at, putting people and personnel in place to do all of these awful policies? Or is he a total nut job who gets distracted by any shiny object he sees on the street as he's walking down the pavement and can't be trusted because he's, to hold power because he's totally incompetent?
The second one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's kind of a contradiction there, and I think that I think you also have to understand that a big reason that American voters tune that out, because right of center voters in particular have been hearing this about every Republican candidate since 1980 at least. So I think that rightly or wrongly it loses all of its potency, and I mean I don't want to pick on my fellow panelists, but I will point out that we've just had an election season where we were told that you had to vote for Kamala Harris because Donald Trump is a fascist and an authoritarian and the second coming of Hitler and all of the rest of it. And now we're already preparing ourselves to say that J.D. Vance is even scarier than that. So I mean, I think that there is this issue where it's kind of hard to know what anyone even means when they use those words now, because I think that kind of in American politics it has become shorthand for a politician that you don't like, and I want to emphasize, and this actually is an opportunity to make a point that keeps coming up about Trump's rhetoric on this, because I think that you make a terrible mistake if you don't realize that he's trolling you, and this in fact is a big part of his appeal with conservative voters who are so sick of hearing this said about every Republican candidate every 4 years. I think that part of his, you can either call it genius or perverse genius, is his ability, as he did with that garbage truck stunt, to sort of take a charge that has been leveled at Republicans or at him personally in various ways and sort of mold it around in a way that kind of mocks the fact that Americans have heard so much of that. And so I think that that's kind of the interpretation that you should put on a lot of these comments, or if you go back and you look at them in context, it's sort of like an offhand comment that he's made that I think can often read as if he is actually deliberately trying to needle his critics by playing into this stereotype that they've created. And I mean, you can agree or you can disagree with that, but I think that if you're not going to recognize that that's a big part of the political method here, and that a lot of it is this theater that is intended to poke at or undermine his critics, I think that you're going to continue making the same mistake, which is that I think the Democrats have got to find some way of talking about Republican opponents that doesn't suggest that the apocalypse is nigh.
Yeah, but one does have to say, that term fascism was used by both sides. I mean, you can easily find clips of Donald Trump using that label to frame Kamala Harris.
Well, but again, that's the trolling phenomenon.
Well, maybe that's one way to view it.
There's one major difference between the Democrats saying it and Donald Trump and his followers saying it. The Democrats don't have Project 2025.
Well, and the Republicans didn't have Project 2025.
And so the
because-
Project 2025 will lead us to what Donald Trump has suggested would be the truth of an authoritarian government and leadership. So I think it's more than rhetoric. I think it's quite tangible, and we could see how it will play out if you visited 2025 at all, Project 2025 at all.
Well, but I mean, if you read that document, you could tell that a lot of it was wishful thinking from the think tank that created it, and it was really
Who were
difficult to
former
imagine
Trump
a Trump
employees.
administration actually doing a lot of it. So, which is why I think that he kind of distanced himself from it.
There was a
I want-
question for me from here.
Yes.
What's that?
There was a question here. for me.
Yes, so do
I
you
should
want,
answer
you want to
that.
take that
Yeah, yeah.
question? And then I'll take your question in the back.
Is that okay? Can I answer questions?
You can go first.
I should say, I wasn't saying it, Larry Kramer was saying it, that, this is, the US is 15 years ahead of what's going on in Europe, but you're right. We've seen in the several elections that have happened this year, we saw it in the UK, of course, look at the rise of the reform vote. It's happened everywhere, Sweden, Austria, France, Germany, you name it, it's Hungary's always been there, but this is the others are catching up, so to speak. The right, Meloni in Italy, so that's a fact. I think to think about it, there are two things. One is that there is at the heart of this right-wing rhetoric in Europe, at least, the issue of immigration. There's complete inability to think through this issue, to actually have a sane immigration policy. Partly because there are two reasons behind it. One is that the economies, and it goes back to that economic question, if you run a certain kind of neoliberal economics requires a precarious workforce, which immigrants provide. And secondly, there is a refusal of historical reckoning. Right? It's turned into culture wars, as we saw under the Tory government here. So any talk of trying to explain why people from Ghana and India and the Caribbean are in Britain in terms of understanding British history, which is not taught in its entirety to school children, is seen to be a culture war. So, and unless those questions are openly debated and discussed without immediately taking, to call it woke or whatever, you're not going to solve this issue, and it's only going to fuel right-wing politics.
So on your question in the back, I would say once the dust settles and the Democrats get beyond the shell shock and so forth, then the names that will come up very quickly will be Gretchen Whitmer, Josh Shapiro, and Gavin Newsom. And perhaps if he does actually run for governor, and he says that he will, Buttigieg. And I mention this because that the governor position will be the post position to younger for sure. That matters, I think, a lot. But to be able to run from the outside against Washington. I mean, I think Kamala Harris ran as strong a campaign. I mean, if you just stop and think about this is almost like a British electoral campaign. I mean, it was totally compressed in time and from really a standing start. But she had the burden of being the incumbent or some version of the incumbent. And, if you're coming at it, especially if you're coming at it in administration, that my prediction is that they will overreach, that coming from the outside, offers a much better lane. So I would expect those names, and maybe there will be some others.
Could I add Westmore?
Yeah. Yes, good name.
Yeah.
Add to it.
As a conservative, am I allowed to offer some advice to Democrats here?
Yes. Not Gavin Newsom.
No. I'm going to offer procedural advice for Democrats. I think that if you have aspirations for the presidency in the Democratic Party, embrace American federalism, which means sort of go out to a state, run for governor, get experience managing that state, and then also delete Twitter from your phone, or X or whatever we're calling it now, from your phone, and delete any contacts in your phone with a Washington, D.C. area code. And the reason I say that is I think that, a really problematic trend for both parties, but I think this is going to become a real issue for the Democrats, is the fact that everything is becoming so centralized and nationalized in American politics. And I think that if you're in the pickle that the Democrats are in right now, where they're really struggling to figure out what the right political and policy offer is for these voters who have drifted out of the Democratic coalition, you need to experiment a lot. And in the American system, where you do that is at the state level, and you can't do it effectively if you constantly have this cacophony on your phone every time you open X of this activist class in Washington yammering at you about how everything you're doing is wrong.
I would just say this, that I agree with what you say, Peter, about the possible candidates. But I would hope that this moment says to America that it's time to lay the groundwork from a state level for a third party. That's what I hope this moment says. That's not going to happen in 4 years or 8 years. But for there to be some folks in here that are saying, how do we help to lay the groundwork so that 40 years from now, 24 years from now, there can be a viable third party that understands how to get to 270 if we haven't done away with Electoral College. That's what I think is. All of the developed nations around the world have more than 2 viable parties. Why does America only have 2 still? That's where I think part of the challenge is. For me, with this election, I was deeply troubled that Kamala was given to me. I was deeply troubled by it. But I had already, as I said earlier, I had to I registered as an independent to say, who do I really think in this moment that's in front of us that can get this done, since the Democrats did not have a primary, and I really thought it was Nikki Haley. I thought she could lead us in a different direction. I don't agree with all of her thinking, but I thought she was the one that America needed for now. And I think if she'd have gotten the nomination, this would have played out quite differently.
I realize we have 3 minutes here. So I thought I'd give each one of you just maybe an opportunity for a last comment or thought. Maybe Muku, why don't we start with you, and then I'll
I
come to
think
you.
I said everything I wanted to say.
Okay, well then you're ceding time to the conservative on the panel.
For now.
Yeah.
It's his day.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, conservative but not Republican, so let's not get ahead of ourselves there. Okay, look, I get it. I know that most people in this room would not have voted for Trump if given the opportunity, or if you are an American, you probably did not vote for Trump, and I think that is perfectly legitimate, But politics is an iterative process, and whether we like it or not, we're going to have a midterm in 2 years, and we're going to have another presidential election in 4 years, and it's going to keep grinding on like that ceaselessly into the distant expanses of time. And I think that a problem that I think has developed on the political left, which is making it difficult for Democrats to reach the people who are currently voting Republican, is a lack of respect for those voters and a lack of curiosity about what might positively be motivating them, aside from whatever negative things are motivating them. And so I think that my warning, as someone who is in that milieu and speaking to an audience that probably is not, is that it's important to figure out how you can listen respectfully to those voters and not sort of pre-assume what is motivating them, and then speak respectfully to them, or we're going to continue doing these events where we're going to be surprised that the voters have behaved in ways that we didn't expect.
Muku, it looks like you want to say something.
I will. Just to say, I'm going to reiterate what I said before. I think it's really important when we're talking about elections and democracy to remember that each of us, you know, several of my students are in the room, I know, thank you for coming, but also democracy is not just a set of institutions. It has to be cultivated every single day. And I think that means each one of us. It's about remaining informed, it's about organizing, it's about creating solidarity, it's about remaining vigilant, and it's about hope. It's about patience. And I think sometimes in this critique of what is wrong and what is right, we forget that at the end of the day, you know, a democratic project is a hopeful project. It is always about trying to make a better society than the one we have. And if that's the case, it's not going to come from somewhere else. It's not going to come from Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. It's going to come from us. And that sense of cultivation, I think, is, and it's absolutely germane to the American democratic tradition, so it's entirely appropriate to say it at this event. That's the message I would like to leave you with, if that's the one thing you take away from my remarks. Thank you.
I would say that in the age of polarization, where conversations often collapse into bitter arguments, that it's essential to create brave spaces where we can listen to each other. Because I think if we listen long enough, we might walk away saying, how do we together build this ideal of a democracy? And that's going to take empathy.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Joe, Mukulika, Keith, thank you. This was a terrific panel. Please join me in thanking the panel. And thank all of you for coming. Great to have you here.